Question 1. The investigation demonstrates that an internal audit of the medical device manufacturer's risk management process identified several instances of incomplete risk assessments for certain device modifications. The audit report details specific deviations from the procedures outlined in the company's quality management system, which is intended to align with ISO 14971. The quality manager is considering how to respond to these findings. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with ISO 14971 and upholds professional responsibility? Option A. Document the audit findings and close the audit report, assuming the identified deviations are minor and unlikely to impact device safety given the nature of the modifications. Option B. Initiate a formal retraining program for all personnel involved in risk assessment, focusing on general risk management principles, without specifically addressing the identified deviations from the established procedures. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of all identified nonconformities against the specific requirements of ISO 14971, perform a root cause analysis for each, and develop a detailed COPPA plan with verification of effectiveness. Option D. Implement immediate, minor procedural adjustments to the risk assessment forms without a thorough root cause analysis or verification of effectiveness to quickly satisfy the audit requirement. The correct answer is A. Document the audit findings and close the audit report, assuming the identified deviations are minor and unlikely to impact device safety given the nature of the modifications. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, reconciling internal audit findings with external regulatory expectations. The challenge lies in determining the appropriate level of response to identified nonconformities, balancing the need for thorough corrective action with the practicalities of resource allocation and the potential impact on product availability. A key difficulty is interpreting the severity and scope of the audit findings in the context of ISO 14971 and ensuring that the proposed actions are not only compliant but also effective in preventing recurrence. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, which involves a comprehensive review of the audit findings against ISO 14971 requirements and the development of a robust COPPA plan, represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the root causes of the nonconformities. This aligns with the fundamental principles of ISO 14971, which mandates a systematic process for risk management, including the review of post-market information and the implementation of corrective actions. A thorough review ensures that the COPPA plan is not merely a superficial fix, but a strategic intervention designed to enhance the overall risk management system. This proactive stance demonstrates a commitment to patient safety and regulatory compliance, which are paramount in the medical device industry. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that focuses solely on documenting the audit findings without implementing corrective actions fails to meet the core requirements of ISO 14971. This is a significant regulatory failure, as it bypasses the essential step of risk mitigation and prevention of recurrence. Ethically, it is unacceptable as it prioritizes administrative closure over patient safety. An approach that implements superficial corrective actions that do not address the root cause of the nonconformities is also a regulatory failure. ISO 14971 requires effective corrective actions. Such an approach may satisfy a basic audit requirement, but leaves the underlying risks unmanaged, potentially leading to future incidents. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the principles of effective risk management. An approach that dismisses the audit findings as minor without a documented, risk-based justification is a critical regulatory and ethical failure. ISO 14971 requires a systematic evaluation of all identified issues. Ignoring findings without proper assessment implies a disregard for potential risks and a failure to uphold the organization's responsibility to ensure device safety. This can lead to serious consequences, including regulatory enforcement actions and harm to patients. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the scope and impact of the audit findings. This involves a detailed review of the audit report and a cross-reference with the specific clauses of ISO 14971 that have been cited. The next step is to conduct a root cause analysis for each identified nonconformity. Based on this analysis, a comprehensive corrective and preventive action CAPA plan should be developed, ensuring that the proposed actions are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. SMART. The effectiveness of these actions must then be verified. This systematic process ensures that the organization not only complies with regulatory requirements, but also demonstrably improves its risk management system and enhances patient safety. Question 2. Upon reviewing the risk management file for a novel implantable cardiac defibrillator (ICD) system, the risk management team has identified a residual risk of device malfunction leading to inappropriate shock delivery. While the probability of this specific malfunction is assessed as low e.g. 1 in 10,000 device years, the consequence for a patient experiencing an inappropriate shock can be severe, potentially leading to psychological distress, unnecessary medical interventions, and in rare cases, direct harm. The anticipated benefit of the ICD system is significant, offering life-saving therapy for patients at high risk of sudden cardiac death. The manufacturer has implemented all reasonably practicable risk control measures, but the residual risk cannot be entirely eliminated. Considering the principles of ISO 14971, which of the following best describes the manufacturer's responsibility in proceeding with the risk-benefit analysis for this ICD system? Option A. Focus solely on the severity of the consequence of inappropriate shock delivery and deem the residual risk unacceptable, even if the probability is very low and the benefits are life-saving. Option B. Conclude that the residual risk of inappropriate shock delivery is acceptable because the overall benefit of preventing sudden cardiac death is substantial and outweighs the low probability of this specific malfunction. Option C. Immediately cease further development and market entry plans for the ICD system until a method to completely eliminate the risk of inappropriate shock delivery is identified, regardless of the time and resources required. Option D. Accept the residual risk of inappropriate shock delivery without further detailed justification, assuming that the significant benefit of preventing sudden cardiac death inherently makes any residual risk acceptable. The correct answer is B. Conclude that the residual risk of inappropriate shock delivery is acceptable because the overall benefit of preventing sudden cardiac death is substantial and outweighs the low probability of this specific malfunction. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a classic ethical dilemma in medical device risk management, specifically concerning the risk-benefit analysis required by ISO 14971. The challenge lies in balancing the potential for significant patient benefit against the identified residual risks, especially when those risks are difficult to fully mitigate and the benefits are not universally experienced or are highly dependent on individual patient factors. The manufacturer faces pressure to bring a potentially life-saving device to market while upholding their responsibility to patient safety. The ethical tension arises from the inherent uncertainty in predicting the precise impact of the residual risks across a diverse patient population and the potential for harm versus the clear, albeit not guaranteed, benefit. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a rigorous and documented assessment that clearly articulates the rationale for concluding that the residual risks are acceptable in relation to the anticipated benefits. This aligns with the fundamental principles of ISO 14971, which mandates that the overall residual risk shall be judged acceptable. This judgment must be based on a comprehensive risk-benefit analysis, considering the intended use, the characteristics of the patient population, and the state of the art. The manufacturer must demonstrate that the benefits of using the device, as intended, outweigh the identified residual risks. This involves a qualitative and, where appropriate, quantitative evaluation, supported by evidence and expert opinion, and must be clearly documented in the risk management file. The emphasis is on a well-reasoned justification that can withstand scrutiny from regulatory bodies and demonstrate due diligence in protecting patient safety. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the identified residual risks as negligible simply because the device offers a significant potential benefit. This fails to acknowledge the core requirement of ISO 14971 to assess and manage residual risks. The standard does not permit a blanket acceptance of risk based solely on perceived benefit, each identified risk must be evaluated. This approach represents a regulatory failure by not adhering to the systematic risk assessment process, and an ethical failure by potentially exposing patients to preventable harm. Another incorrect approach would be to delay market entry indefinitely due to the inability to completely eliminate all residual risks, even if those risks are deemed minor and the benefits substantial. While a cautious approach is commendable, ISO 14971 recognizes that absolute elimination of risk is often not feasible. The standard requires a judgment of acceptability, not necessarily zero risk. This approach could be considered a failure to meet the needs of patients who could benefit from the device, potentially leading to a different kind of harm, e.g., through lack of treatment options. Ethically, it could be seen as an overcautious stance that deprives patients of a valuable medical intervention. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on anecdotal evidence or marketing claims to justify the risk-benefit balance, without robust data or a systematic evaluation. This bypasses the structured risk management process required by ISO 14971. The standard demands objective evidence and a structured analysis, not subjective assertions. This constitutes a significant regulatory failure by not fulfilling the documentation and evidence requirements of the standard, and an ethical failure by potentially misleading stakeholders about the true risk profile of the device. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such dilemmas by adhering strictly to the ISO 14971 framework. This involves 1. Thoroughly identifying and analyzing all hazards and hazardous situations. 2. Estimating and evaluating the associated risks. 3. Implementing risk control measures. 4. Reevaluating the residual risks after control measures are applied. 5. Conducting a comprehensive risk-benefit analysis, documenting the rationale for deeming residual risks acceptable in relation to the anticipated benefits. This process should involve cross-functional teams, including clinical experts, engineers, and regulatory affairs specialists. Transparency in documentation and clear justification for the final risk acceptability decision are paramount. When faced with uncertainty, a conservative approach to risk assessment and control is generally preferred, but this must be balanced against the need to provide beneficial medical technologies to patients. Question 3. The performance metrics show a recurring anomaly in the device's operation that, while not immediately causing patient harm, has the potential to lead to a significant adverse event if left unaddressed. Considering the hierarchy of risk control measures outlined in ISO 14971, which of the following actions best represents the most appropriate initial response to mitigate this identified risk? Option A. Requiring all operators to wear specialized protective gear when using the device to shield them from potential consequences of the anomaly. Option B. Issuing a field safety notice to temporarily suspend the use of the device until a software patch can be developed and deployed. Option C. Conducting a thorough root cause analysis to identify opportunities for design modification or component substitution that would eliminate or reduce the likelihood of the anomaly occurring. Option D. Implementing enhanced user training protocols and updating the device's operating manual to include specific warnings and workarounds for the anomaly. Correct answer is D. Implementing enhanced user training protocols and updating the device's operating manual to include specific warnings and workarounds for the anomaly. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for a functional medical device with the long-term imperative of robust risk management, specifically concerning the hierarchy of risk control measures. The performance metrics indicate a potential issue, but the urgency of patient care might tempt stakeholders to prioritize less effective, but quicker, solutions. The challenge lies in adhering strictly to ISO 14971 principles, which mandate a systematic approach to risk reduction, even when faced with operational pressures. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough reevaluation of the risk control measures in place for the identified performance anomaly, prioritizing the hierarchy of controls as mandated by ISO 14971. This means first considering elimination or substitution of the hazardous condition or the device itself if feasible. If not, engineering controls that intrinsically reduce the risk at the source are the next priority. Administrative controls, such as revised operating procedures or enhanced training, are less preferred as they rely on human adherence. Personal protective equipment, PPE, is the least effective and should only be considered as a last resort or supplementary measure. This systematic, top-down approach ensures that the most effective and reliable risk reduction strategies are implemented, aligning with the ethical obligation to protect patients and users and the regulatory requirement to manage risks throughout the device lifecycle. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing administrative controls as the primary solution without first exhausting elimination, substitution, or engineering controls represents a failure to adhere to the risk control hierarchy. This is ethically problematic as it places a greater reliance on human factors, which are prone to error, rather than intrinsically safer design. It also fails to meet the spirit and letter of ISO 14971, which explicitly ranks these control measures. Relying solely on PPE without addressing the root cause through higher-level controls is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. PPE does not eliminate the hazard. It merely provides a barrier, and its effectiveness is dependent on correct usage and maintenance, making it a less reliable risk control. Furthermore, it often signifies a failure in the design or manufacturing process to adequately mitigate risks. Introducing a new, unvalidated engineering control without a comprehensive risk assessment and verification process is also a failure. While engineering controls are preferred, introducing them without proper due diligence can introduce new, unforeseen risks, violating the principle of continuous risk management and potentially contravening regulatory requirements for device validation and safety. Professional reasoning. Professionals must adopt a systematic decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the identified risk. This involves referencing the relevant risk management standard, ISO 14971, and its explicit guidance on the hierarchy of controls. The process should involve 1. Identifying the hazard and hazardous situation, 2. Assessing the risk, 3. Evaluating the effectiveness of existing controls, 4. Determining if further risk reduction is required, and 5. Selecting and implementing risk control measures in order of preference, elimination, substitution, engineering, administrative, PPE. Each proposed control measure must be subject to a risk assessment to ensure it does not introduce unacceptable new risks. Documentation of this process is critical for regulatory compliance and demonstrating due diligence. Question 4. Examination of the data shows that a failure modes and effects analysis, FME, for a novel infusion pump identified a critical failure mode where the pump could deliver an incorrect dose due to a software glitch. A risk control measure involving a redundant dose verification algorithm was implemented. Which of the following actions best demonstrates compliance with ISO 14971 regarding the effectiveness of this risk control measure? Option A. Assessing the severity of an incorrect dose delivery as high, as stated in the initial FME. Option B. Reviewing the FME documentation to ensure the software glitch and its potential consequences were adequately described. Option C. Counting the number of potential software glitches identified in the FME to ensure comprehensive failure mode identification. Option D. Confirming through testing that the redundant dose verification algorithm successfully detects and flags the software glitch, thereby preventing the delivery of an incorrect dose. The correct answer is D. Confirming through testing that the redundant dose verification algorithm successfully detects and flags the software glitch, thereby preventing the delivery of an incorrect dose. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, ensuring that the chosen risk control measures are adequately validated and that the residual risk is acceptable. The challenge lies in moving beyond a theoretical identification of failure modes to a practical demonstration of their mitigation. Professionals must demonstrate that the FME, a key tool under ISO 14971, has been effectively implemented, and its outputs translated into tangible improvements that reduce risk to an acceptable level. This requires a deep understanding of the device's intended use, potential failure mechanisms, and the effectiveness of proposed controls. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core requirement of ISO 14971, demonstrating that risks have been reduced to an acceptable level. By verifying that the FME identified a critical failure mode and that the implemented control measure has demonstrably reduced the probability of that failure mode occurring, the manufacturer provides objective evidence of risk reduction. This aligns with the standard's emphasis on iterative risk management and the need for evidence to support risk acceptability decisions. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the FME initial assessment without verifying the effectiveness of the control measure fails to meet the standard's requirements for verification and validation of risk control measures. This is a regulatory failure because it bypasses the crucial step of confirming that the implemented controls actually work as intended to reduce risk. Ethically, it is unacceptable as it may lead to the release of a device with unmitigated or inadequately mitigated risks, potentially harming patients. Another incorrect approach that focuses on the severity of the failure mode without considering the effectiveness of the control measure is also a regulatory and ethical failure. ISO 14971 requires a holistic assessment of risk, considering both severity and probability of occurrence. Ignoring the impact of the control measure on the probability of occurrence means the residual risk assessment is incomplete and potentially inaccurate. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes the number of failure modes identified over the effectiveness of their mitigation is a misinterpretation of the FME purpose. The goal is not simply to list potential failures, but to systematically analyze and reduce the risks associated with them. Focusing on quantity over quality of risk reduction is a significant professional and regulatory failing. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Thoroughly understand the identified failure modes and their associated risks, severity, and probability. 2. Critically evaluate the proposed risk control measures for their technical feasibility and effectiveness in reducing the identified risks. 3. Design and execute verification and validation activities to objectively demonstrate that the risk control measures are effective. 4. Reevaluate the residual risk based on the evidence of control effectiveness. 5. Ensure that the residual risk is acceptable according to the established risk acceptability criteria. 6. Document all steps and evidence meticulously to support the risk management file. Question 5. Performance analysis shows that a medical device manufacturer has developed a comprehensive risk management file in strict adherence to ISO 14971. However, during an internal audit, it was noted that the risk management procedures are not explicitly referenced or integrated into the company's overall quality management system, QMS, documentation, which is designed to meet ISO 13485 requirements. This raises a question about how these two critical standards should be practically aligned to ensure regulatory compliance and product safety. Which of the following best describes the correct relationship and integration approach between ISO 14971 and ISO 13485 for this manufacturer? Option A. ISO 14971 is a supplementary standard, and its requirements can be addressed independently of the main quality management system documentation required by ISO 13485, as long as a risk management file exists. Option B. Manufacturers should prioritize the detailed risk management processes of ISO 14971 and create separate, detailed documentation for these activities, which can be maintained independently from the broader ISO 13485 QMS documentation. Option C. The risk management activities detailed in ISO 14971 must be documented and implemented as a core component of the quality management system required by ISO 13485, ensuring systematic integration throughout the product lifecycle. Option D. The quality management system, as defined by ISO 13485, is sufficient for managing risks, and ISO 14971 serves only as a reference for best practices that do not need to be formally integrated into the QMS procedures. The correct answer is C. The risk management activities detailed in ISO 14971 must be documented and implemented as a core component of the quality management system required by ISO 13485, ensuring systematic integration throughout the product lifecycle. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where a perceived conflict arises between the requirements of ISO 14971 and ISO 13485, specifically concerning the documentation and integration of risk management activities within the broader quality management system. The challenge lies in interpreting how these standards, while distinct, are intended to interrelate and support each other to ensure the safety and effectiveness of medical devices. A hasty or incomplete understanding could lead to either an overemphasis on one standard at the expense of the other, or a failure to achieve the synergistic benefits they offer. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach recognizes that ISO 14971 provides the specific methodology for risk management of medical devices, while ISO 13485 establishes the overarching quality management system requirements for medical device manufacturers. ISO 13485 mandates that risk management be applied throughout the product lifecycle and integrated into the QMS. Therefore, the risk management process detailed in ISO 14971 must be documented and implemented as a core component of the QMS required by ISO 13485. This ensures that risk management is not an isolated activity, but is systematically embedded within all relevant processes, from design and development to post-market surveillance. This integrated approach is best professional practice because it directly addresses the regulatory expectation of a comprehensive and effective QMS that prioritizes device safety. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to treat ISO 14971 as a standalone document, implementing its risk management processes without explicitly integrating them into the QMS documentation and procedures required by ISO 13485. This failure stems from a misunderstanding of the system aspect of ISO 13485, leading to a fragmented approach where risk management activities might not be consistently applied, reviewed, or controlled as part of the overall quality system. This poses a regulatory risk as it may not demonstrate compliance with the integrated QMS requirements. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the QMS requirements of ISO 13485 and to interpret ISO 14971 as merely a set of guidelines that can be loosely followed, without establishing robust, documented procedures for risk analysis, evaluation, control, and monitoring as mandated by ISO 14971. This would lead to a QMS that lacks the specific, detailed risk management framework necessary for medical devices, potentially resulting in inadequate risk mitigation and increased patient harm. Ethically, this fails to uphold the primary responsibility of ensuring device safety. A third incorrect approach might involve creating separate, unlinked documentation for risk management activities that do not clearly demonstrate how they feed into or are supported by other QMS processes outlined in ISO 13485, such as design controls, production, or post-market surveillance. This lack of clear linkage makes it difficult to demonstrate a holistic approach to quality and safety, potentially leading to gaps in oversight and control. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach the relationship between ISO 14971 and ISO 13485 by understanding that ISO 13485 sets the framework for a quality management system, and ISO 14971 provides the specific, detailed requirements for risk management within that framework. The decision-making process should involve 1. Thoroughly understanding the requirements of both standards. 2. Identifying how the risk management processes defined in ISO 14971 can be effectively integrated into the QMS processes mandated by ISO 13485. 3. Ensuring that documentation clearly shows this integration, demonstrating that risk management is a continuous lifecycle activity managed within the QMS. 4. Regularly reviewing and auditing the integrated system to ensure ongoing compliance and effectiveness. Question 6. Operational review demonstrates a newly identified potential hazard associated with a medical device that, while statistically improbable, could result in severe patient harm. The manufacturer has established risk acceptability criteria based on their policy. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for determining acceptable risk levels in this situation? Option A. Immediately dismiss the hazard as insignificant because its probability of occurrence is extremely low and the device has a good safety record to date. Option B. Rely solely on historical incident data for similar devices to confirm that such an event has not occurred previously, thus deeming the residual risk acceptable. Option C. Proceed with the current risk assessment, assuming existing risk control measures are sufficient, and focus resources on other identified risks with higher probabilities. Option D. Conduct a thorough reevaluation of the risk management file for this specific hazard, assessing its severity, probability, and the effectiveness of existing controls against the manufacturer's established risk acceptability criteria. If the residual risk is unacceptable, implement further risk control measures and reassess. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough reevaluation of the risk management file for this specific hazard, assessing its severity, probability, and the effectiveness of existing controls against the manufacturer's established risk acceptability criteria. If the residual risk is unacceptable, implement further risk control measures and reassess. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, a newly identified potential hazard that, while rare, could lead to severe patient harm. The challenge lies in determining whether the existing risk control measures are sufficient to reduce the residual risk to an acceptable level, as defined by ISO 14971. This requires a nuanced judgment that balances patient safety with the practicalities of device development and market availability. The pressure to release or continue marketing a device, coupled with the inherent uncertainties in predicting rare events, makes this a professionally demanding situation requiring rigorous adherence to the risk management process. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic reevaluation of the risk management file, specifically focusing on the newly identified hazard. This includes assessing the severity of the potential harm, the probability of occurrence, even if low, and the effectiveness of existing risk control measures. If the residual risk is deemed unacceptable according to the established risk acceptability criteria, which should be defined in the risk management plan and aligned with the manufacturer's policy, then further risk control measures must be implemented. This iterative process, documented thoroughly, ensures that the device's residual risk is as low as reasonably practicable and meets the manufacturer's defined acceptability criteria, thereby fulfilling the requirements of ISO 14971 and the overarching principle of patient safety. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to dismiss the hazard because its probability of occurrence is considered extremely low. This fails to acknowledge that even rare events can have catastrophic consequences, and ISO 14971 requires consideration of all identified hazards, regardless of their perceived likelihood. The standard emphasizes that risk acceptability is a function of both severity and probability. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on historical data without considering the specific context of the new hazard or potential changes in device usage or patient population. Historical data may not capture emerging risks or unique failure modes. Furthermore, assuming that existing controls are adequate without a formal reassessment of their effectiveness against the new hazard is a critical failure. This bypasses the systematic review mandated by the standard and could lead to an unacceptable residual risk. Finally, making a decision based on commercial pressures rather than a thorough risk assessment violates the fundamental ethical and regulatory obligation to prioritize patient safety. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this situation by initiating a formal change control process. This process should trigger a review of the risk management file, including hazard identification, risk analysis, risk evaluation, and risk control. The team must consult the manufacturer's risk management policy and risk acceptability criteria. If the residual risk is unacceptable, the team must brainstorm and implement additional risk control measures, reevaluate their effectiveness, and update the risk management file accordingly. This iterative, documented, and evidence-based approach ensures compliance with ISO 14971 and upholds the ethical imperative of patient safety. Question 7. Analysis of the proposed optimization of the medical device risk management process, which aims to streamline activities and reduce turnaround times, requires careful consideration of its impact on the systematic identification, evaluation, and control of risks throughout the device lifecycle. Which of the following approaches best represents a process optimization that enhances both efficiency and effectiveness in accordance with ISO 14971 principles. Option A. Integrating risk management activities into the design and development phases and establishing robust feedback loops from post-market surveillance to inform ongoing risk assessments and control measures. Option B. Significantly reducing the volume of risk documentation by eliminating certain review steps and consolidating reports, with the primary goal of lowering administrative overhead. Option C. Transferring all risk management responsibilities to an external consultant without establishing internal oversight or integration with the product development team. Option D. Shortening the risk evaluation phase for all identified risks to expedite the decision-making process for risk acceptability. The correct answer is A. Integrating risk management activities into the design and development phases and establishing robust feedback loops from post-market surveillance to inform ongoing risk assessments and control measures. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, optimizing the risk management process itself. The challenge lies in balancing the need for efficiency and speed in bringing a device to market with the absolute imperative of ensuring patient safety and regulatory compliance. A purely cost-driven or speed-focused optimization can inadvertently compromise the thoroughness of risk identification, analysis, or evaluation, leading to potential harm. Conversely, an overly bureaucratic or time-consuming optimization can hinder innovation and market access. Therefore, professional judgment is required to identify improvements that enhance effectiveness and efficiency without sacrificing the integrity of the risk management system, as defined by ISO 14971. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach focuses on integrating risk management activities throughout the product lifecycle and leveraging existing data and feedback mechanisms. This aligns with the principles of ISO 14971, which emphasizes a systematic and iterative process. By embedding risk management into design and development, and by utilizing post-market surveillance data for continuous improvement, the process becomes more proactive and less of a standalone, end-of-development activity. This integration ensures that risks are identified and mitigated early, reducing the likelihood of costly redesigns or post-market issues. Furthermore, it fosters a culture of risk awareness within the organization, which is a cornerstone of effective risk management. This approach optimizes the process by making it more efficient and effective, directly contributing to the safety of the medical device. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on reducing the documentation burden without a corresponding assessment of the impact on risk control effectiveness. This is a regulatory failure because ISO 14971 requires adequate documentation to demonstrate that risks have been managed. Simply reducing paperwork without ensuring that the underlying risk management activities remain robust can lead to overlooked hazards or inadequate mitigation strategies, potentially violating the fundamental safety requirements of medical device regulations. Another incorrect approach prioritizes speed by shortening the risk evaluation phase, particularly for identified risks. This is ethically and regulatorily problematic. The risk evaluation phase is critical for determining whether residual risks are acceptable. Rushing this phase can lead to the acceptance of unacceptable risks, directly jeopardizing patient safety and violating the core principle of ISO 14971 to reduce risks to an acceptable level. This also fails to meet the regulatory expectation that manufacturers demonstrate a thorough assessment of risks. A third incorrect approach involves outsourcing all risk management activities to a third party without establishing clear oversight and integration with internal development teams. While external expertise can be valuable, complete outsourcing without internal engagement can lead to a disconnect between the risk management team and the product development realities. This can result in risk assessments that are not fully informed by the practicalities of the device's design, manufacturing, or intended use, potentially leading to ineffective risk controls and a failure to meet regulatory requirements for a comprehensive risk management system owned by the manufacturer. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach process optimization by first understanding the current state of their risk management system and identifying specific pain points or inefficiencies. They should then consider potential improvements through the lens of ISO 14971 principles and relevant regulatory requirements. The decision-making process should involve a risk-based assessment of the proposed optimization itself. What are the risks associated with changing the process? The goal is to enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of risk management, not to bypass critical steps or reduce the overall rigor. Collaboration with cross-functional teams, including design, quality, and regulatory affairs, is essential to ensure that proposed optimizations are practical, effective, and compliant. Continuous monitoring and feedback loops are also crucial to ensure that the optimized process remains effective over time. Question 8. The evaluation methodology shows a new infusion pump's risk assessment process is primarily conducted by the engineering and quality assurance teams, with limited input from clinical end users and no formal mechanism for gathering feedback from hospital biomedical engineers responsible for maintenance. Which approach best ensures compliance with ISO 14971 and robust risk evaluation? Option A. Supplement the existing internal review with a targeted survey sent to a representative sample of clinical end users to gather their perspectives on potential use errors and hazards, and schedule a consultation with a biomedical engineering representative to discuss maintenance-related risks. Option B. Conduct a post-market surveillance study after the device has been released to identify any unforeseen risks that may arise during actual clinical use and maintenance. Option C. Expand the internal review to include a broader range of internal departments, such as marketing and sales, to capture market-related risks, but maintain the exclusion of external clinical and maintenance personnel. Option D. Proceed with the current internal assessment, assuming that the engineering and QA teams possess sufficient expertise to anticipate all foreseeable risks based on their technical knowledge. The correct answer is A. Supplement the existing internal review with a targeted survey sent to a representative sample of clinical end users to gather their perspectives on potential use errors and hazards, and schedule a consultation with a biomedical engineering representative to discuss maintenance-related risks. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a critical juncture in the risk management process for a new medical device. The challenge lies in ensuring that the risk evaluation, a cornerstone of ISO 14971, is comprehensive and reflects real-world use. This requires more than just internal technical assessment. It necessitates the incorporation of diverse perspectives to identify potential hazards and estimate associated risks accurately. The professional challenge is to move beyond a purely theoretical or design-centric view to one that acknowledges the complexities of clinical application and user interaction. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it actively seeks and integrates input from a broad spectrum of stakeholders. This aligns directly with the intent of ISO 14971, which emphasizes a systematic and iterative process. By involving end users, clinicians, patients, service personnel, and regulatory experts, the risk evaluation benefits from practical experience, potential misuse scenarios, and an understanding of the regulatory landscape. This multifaceted input leads to a more robust and realistic assessment of risks, ultimately contributing to the safety and effectiveness of the medical device. Ethically, it demonstrates a commitment to patient safety by proactively identifying and mitigating potential harms. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the design and development team's internal assessment fails to acknowledge the inherent limitations of an insular perspective. Regulatory failure here stems from a lack of due diligence in identifying all reasonably foreseeable risks, a core requirement of risk management. Ethically, it prioritizes internal convenience over thorough safety assurance. Another incorrect approach that only considers feedback from a single user group, such as only clinicians, overlooks the potential risks associated with other stakeholders, like maintenance personnel or even patients themselves, if the device is used in a home setting. This selective engagement leads to an incomplete risk profile and potential regulatory noncompliance due to an inadequate risk assessment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach to stakeholder identification and engagement. This begins with mapping out all potential users and individuals who interact with the device throughout its life cycle. Subsequently, mechanisms for soliciting and incorporating their feedback into the risk evaluation must be established. This could include surveys, interviews, usability studies, and formal review processes. The key is to ensure that the feedback is not merely collected but actively analyzed and used to refine the risk assessment and mitigation strategies, demonstrating a commitment to continuous improvement and regulatory adherence. Question 9. Process analysis reveals that a manufacturer is developing a novel medical device for which limited historical performance data exists. The risk management team is debating the most appropriate approach for conducting the risk analysis to comply with ISO 14971. Which of the following strategies best addresses the implementation challenge of balancing regulatory requirements with data availability for a new product? Option A. Limit the risk analysis exclusively to qualitative methods throughout the device's entire lifecycle, deeming quantitative analysis unnecessary due to inherent uncertainties. Option B. Mandate a comprehensive quantitative risk analysis from the project's inception, utilizing estimations and assumptions to derive numerical risk values even in the absence of empirical data. Option C. Prioritize qualitative risk analysis methods initially and progressively integrate quantitative data as it becomes available through development, testing, and post-market surveillance to refine the risk assessment. Option D. Focus solely on qualitative risk analysis during the initial development phases and then abandon further quantitative risk assessment efforts once the device is launched, assuming risks are adequately controlled. The correct answer is C. Prioritize qualitative risk analysis methods initially and progressively integrate quantitative data as it becomes available through development, testing, and post-market surveillance to refine the risk assessment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in medical device risk management, selecting the appropriate risk analysis methodology when faced with limited historical data for a novel device. The challenge lies in balancing the need for a robust risk assessment that meets regulatory expectations, ISO 14971, with the practical constraints of a new product. Over-reliance on qualitative methods might lead to an incomplete understanding of potential risks, while a premature attempt at quantitative analysis without sufficient data could result in unsubstantiated conclusions and potentially misleading risk levels. Professional judgment is crucial to determine the most effective and compliant approach given the available information. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased implementation of risk analysis, starting with qualitative methods and progressively incorporating quantitative data as it becomes available. This aligns with the iterative nature of risk management as described in ISO 14971. Initially, qualitative techniques such as FME failure mode and effects analysis, or HAZUP hazard and operability study, are essential for identifying potential hazards and failure modes, and for estimating the severity and probability of harm based on expert judgment and available literature. As the device progresses through development, clinical trials, and post-market surveillance, quantitative data, e.g., failure rates from testing, incidence rates from clinical data, can be collected and integrated to refine the risk assessment, moving towards a more precise quantitative analysis where feasible and beneficial. This phased approach ensures that risk management is proactive and adaptive, providing a sound basis for risk control measures and demonstrating compliance with the standards requirements for a systematic and thorough risk assessment. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on qualitative risk analysis throughout the entire life cycle of the device, even when sufficient quantitative data becomes available. This fails to leverage the precision and objectivity that quantitative analysis can offer, potentially leading to an underestimation or overestimation of risk that could impact the effectiveness of risk control measures. Ethically, this could mean not adequately protecting patients if risks are underestimated. From a regulatory perspective, it might be seen as not performing a sufficiently thorough risk assessment as required by ISO 14971, which encourages the use of quantitative methods when appropriate. Another incorrect approach is to insist on a fully quantitative risk analysis from the outset for a novel device with no historical data. This is often impractical and can lead to the generation of speculative or unreliable data. Attempting to assign precise numerical probabilities and severities without a solid empirical basis is not scientifically sound and can undermine the credibility of the risk management file. This approach could lead to regulatory noncompliance because the risk assessment would not be based on objective evidence, and ethically, it could lead to misallocation of resources for risk control based on flawed data. A third incorrect approach is to dismiss the need for quantitative analysis entirely, arguing that qualitative methods are always sufficient. This overlooks the benefits of quantitative data in providing a more objective and defensible basis for risk acceptability decisions, especially for high-risk devices. ISO 14971 emphasizes the importance of understanding the magnitude of risk, which quantitative analysis can help to achieve more effectively than purely qualitative methods. Failing to incorporate quantitative analysis when data permits can be seen as a failure to adequately characterize risk, potentially leading to inadequate risk controls and noncompliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a pragmatic and iterative approach to risk analysis. When dealing with novel devices, begin with qualitative methods to establish a foundational understanding of risks. Actively plan for the collection of relevant quantitative data throughout the device's lifecycle. Regularly review and update the risk assessment, integrating quantitative data as it becomes available to refine risk estimations and validate the effectiveness of risk control measures. This ensures that the risk management process remains dynamic, compliant with ISO 14971, and ultimately contributes to the safety of medical devices. The decision-making process should involve a multidisciplinary team to leverage diverse expertise in identifying hazards, estimating risks, and evaluating the adequacy of controls. Question 10. Research into the development of a novel implantable diagnostic device reveals a potential for device failure that could lead to inaccurate readings. The development team is debating how to best define and assess the risk associated with this failure mode. Which of the following approaches most accurately reflects the definition of risk as per ISO 14971 and best supports a robust risk management process? Option A. Defining risk solely as the probability of the device malfunctioning, irrespective of the clinical consequences of inaccurate readings. Option B. Defining risk as the likelihood that the device will achieve its intended diagnostic purpose, with a focus on performance metrics. Option C. Defining risk as the combination of the probability of occurrence of a hazardous situation and the severity of the harm that can result from that situation. Option D. Defining risk as the cost associated with potential product recalls and litigation if the device fails. The correct answer is A. Defining risk solely as the probability of the device malfunctioning, irrespective of the clinical consequences of inaccurate readings. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, accurately defining and assessing risk in the context of a new technology with limited historical data. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need for innovation and market access with the paramount ethical and regulatory obligation to ensure patient safety. A thorough understanding of the definition of risk, as stipulated by ISO 14971, is fundamental to this process. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly aligns with the core principles of ISO 14971. It acknowledges that risk is a function of the probability of harm occurring and the severity of that harm. By systematically identifying hazards, estimating the likelihood of harm, and evaluating the severity of potential harm, the manufacturer is adhering to the structured, evidence-based methodology required by the standard. This comprehensive assessment allows for the development of appropriate risk control measures and ultimately supports the determination of acceptable risk. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the probability of a malfunction without considering the severity of the resulting harm is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. ISO 14971 explicitly defines risk as a combination of both factors. Ignoring severity can lead to an underestimation of the overall risk, potentially resulting in inadequate risk control measures and an unsafe device. Similarly, an approach that prioritizes marketability over a thorough risk assessment is ethically reprehensible and violates the fundamental purpose of medical device regulation, which is to protect public health. This demonstrates a disregard for patient safety and a failure to comply with the spirit and letter of ISO 14971. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a rigorous adherence to the risk management process outlined in ISO 14971. This includes 1. establishing the intended use and reasonably foreseeable misuse of the device. 2. Systematically identifying all potential hazards associated with the device. 3. Estimating the probability of occurrence of each hazardous situation and the severity of the resulting harm. 4. Evaluating the risk associated with each hazardous situation. 5. Implementing risk control measures to reduce unacceptable risks. And 6. Verifying the effectiveness of these measures. Throughout this process, open communication and collaboration among cross-functional teams, including engineering, clinical affairs, and regulatory affairs, are crucial. Question 11. The control framework reveals that a risk control measure has been designed and documented within the risk management file. Which of the following actions is the most critical next step to ensure the effectiveness of this risk control measure? Option A. Conduct objective verification activities, such as testing or simulation, to gather evidence that the risk control measure performs as intended and reduces the identified risk. Option B. Review the design documentation to confirm that the risk control measure is clearly described and integrated into the device's design. Option C. Assume the risk control measure is effective based on its similarity to controls used in previously approved devices. Option D. Assess the cost and complexity of implementing the risk control measure to ensure it is economically viable. The correct answer is A. Conduct objective verification activities, such as testing or simulation, to gather evidence that the risk control measure performs as intended and reduces the identified risk. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, confirming that implemented risk control measures are truly effective in reducing risk to an acceptable level, as required by ISO 14971. The difficulty lies in moving beyond mere implementation to demonstrable verification. Professionals must ensure that the verification methods chosen are appropriate, scientifically sound, and provide objective evidence of effectiveness. This requires a deep understanding of the device's intended use, potential hazards, and the specific risk control measures applied. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core requirement of ISO 14971 for verification of risk control effectiveness. It emphasizes obtaining objective evidence through testing or other suitable methods that demonstrate the risk control measure performs as intended and reduces the identified risk. This aligns with the standard's emphasis on a systematic and documented process, ensuring that the residual risk is acceptable and that the device can be manufactured consistently with the implemented controls. This rigorous verification is crucial for patient safety and regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach that relies solely on design review without objective evidence fails to meet the verification requirement. Design reviews are a valuable part of risk management, but they are primarily a means of assessing the adequacy of the proposed risk control measure, not its effectiveness in practice. Relying only on design review without subsequent verification leaves a gap in the evidence chain, potentially leading to the acceptance of ineffective controls. This is a regulatory failure, as it does not provide the objective evidence mandated by ISO 14971. Another incorrect approach that assumes effectiveness based on historical use of similar controls without specific verification for the current device is also professionally unacceptable. While past experience can inform risk assessment, each device and its specific risk control implementation must be verified independently. General assumptions do not constitute objective evidence for the current device, and this approach risks overlooking unique failure modes or interactions specific to the new design. This represents a failure to adhere to the systematic verification process required by the standard. A third incorrect approach that focuses on the ease of implementation of the risk control measure rather than its effectiveness is fundamentally flawed. The primary goal of a risk control measure is to reduce risk. While ease of implementation is a desirable characteristic, it is secondary to achieving the intended risk reduction. Prioritizing implementation over effectiveness directly contradicts the purpose of risk control and can lead to the acceptance of controls that do not adequately protect users. This is an ethical and regulatory failure, as it compromises patient safety for operational convenience. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Clearly identify the identified hazard and the associated risk. 2. Define the specific risk control measure implemented to mitigate that risk. 3. Determine the objective criteria for verifying the effectiveness of the risk control measure. 4. Select appropriate verification methods, e.g., testing, simulation, analysis, that can provide objective evidence against these criteria. 5. Execute the verification activities and document the results thoroughly. 6. Evaluate the verification results to confirm that the risk control measure is effective and that the residual risk is acceptable. 7. If verification fails, reevaluate the risk control measure or implement additional controls and repeat the verification process. Question 12. Benchmark analysis indicates that a medical device manufacturer has received an increasing number of user complaints over the past 6 months regarding a specific, albeit rare, adverse event. While the initial risk assessment did not identify this event as a significant risk, the trend in complaints suggests a potential shift in the device's risk profile. Which of the following actions best demonstrates adherence to the principles of ISO 14971 regarding post-market surveillance and ongoing risk management? Option A. Rely on the initial risk assessment as definitive, considering that the reported events are isolated incidents and do not represent a systemic issue with the device's design or intended use. Option B. Initiate a thorough investigation into the reported adverse events. Analyze the collected data to determine if the probability or severity of the hazard has changed, and update the risk management file accordingly, implementing further risk control measures if necessary. Option C. Immediately halt production and distribution of the device and initiate a recall, as the increase in complaints indicates a critical failure in the original risk assessment. Option D. Continue to monitor the complaint data, assuming that the increase is within acceptable statistical variation and does not warrant immediate action until a significant number of similar events are reported. The correct answer is B. Initiate a thorough investigation into the reported adverse events. Analyze the collected data to determine if the probability or severity of the hazard has changed, and update the risk management file accordingly, implementing further risk control measures if necessary. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, effectively integrating post-market data into ongoing risk assessments. The professional challenge lies in discerning the significance of emerging data and determining the appropriate level of response, balancing patient safety with the practicalities of device modification and regulatory compliance. Careful judgment is required to avoid both overreaction and complacency. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core principle of ISO 14971, the continuous nature of risk management. Post-market surveillance is not merely a data collection exercise. It is an integral part of the risk management process. By actively analyzing and evaluating the collected data, the manufacturer demonstrates a commitment to identifying new hazards or changes in the severity or probability of known hazards. This proactive stance ensures that the risk management file remains current and that the residual risks are acceptable throughout the device's lifecycle. This aligns with the ethical imperative to protect patient safety and the regulatory expectation that manufacturers maintain an up-to-date understanding of their device's performance in the real world. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the initial risk assessment without incorporating post-market data fails to acknowledge the dynamic nature of medical device performance. This represents a significant regulatory failure, as ISO 14971 explicitly mandates the review of information from the post-production phase. Ethically, it is unacceptable as it prioritizes expediency over patient well-being, potentially leaving users exposed to unmitigated or newly identified risks. Another incorrect approach that involves immediate, drastic design changes based on isolated or unverified reports overlooks the need for thorough data analysis and risk evaluation. This can lead to unnecessary device modifications, increased costs, and potential introduction of new risks. It fails to adhere to the systematic approach required by ISO 14971, which emphasizes evidence-based decision-making. Ethically, it can be seen as an overreaction that may disrupt clinical workflows and patient care without sufficient justification. Third incorrect approach that dismisses post-market data as insignificant without proper investigation is a critical failure. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for potential safety signals. It directly contravenes the regulatory requirement to collect and review all available information relevant to the safety of the device. Ethically, it is a dereliction of duty, as it prioritizes the status quo over the potential for harm to patients. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Establish clear procedures for collecting and categorizing post-market data. 2. Implement a systematic process for analyzing this data, looking for trends, anomalies, and potential new hazards or changes in risk profiles. 3. Evaluate the identified issues against the existing risk management plan and risk assessment. 4. Determine the necessity and scope of any corrective or preventive actions, including design changes, updated labeling, or user training. 5. Document all findings, decisions, and actions thoroughly in the risk management file. This iterative process ensures that risk management remains a living, dynamic system. Question 13. Which approach would be most effective in developing a risk matrix for a novel medical device, ensuring compliance with ISO 14971 and robust risk assessment? Option A. Developing severity levels that are primarily influenced by the cost of potential adverse events rather than the direct impact on patient health and safety. Option B. Defining severity levels based on the potential for irreversible harm to the patient and probability levels based on the frequency of occurrence in similar device categories, with clear, documented criteria for each level specific to the device's intended use and foreseeable misuse. Option C. Establishing probability scales using broad, industry-standard terms like rare, unlikely, and frequent, without specific quantitative or qualitative definitions tailored to the medical device's operational environment. Option D. Creating a risk matrix using historical data from unrelated medical devices and applying generic probability and severity scales without specific validation for the new device. The correct answer is B. Defining severity levels based on the potential for irreversible harm to the patient and probability levels based on the frequency of occurrence in similar device categories, with clear, documented criteria for each level specific to the device's intended use and foreseeable misuse. Explanation. The development of a risk matrix for medical devices under ISO 14971 presents a significant professional challenge due to the inherent subjectivity in assigning severity and probability levels. Manufacturers must establish a robust and defensible system that balances the need for a practical tool with the imperative of thorough risk assessment. The challenge lies in ensuring consistency, reproducibility, and alignment with regulatory expectations for risk acceptability. Careful judgment is required to define clear, unambiguous criteria for each level within the matrix, preventing arbitrary decisions that could lead to underestimation or overestimation of risks. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core principles of ISO 14971 by linking the risk matrix to the device's intended use, foreseeable misuse, and the characteristics of the patient and user population. It emphasizes a systematic and documented process for defining the scales of severity and probability, ensuring that these definitions are specific to the medical device context and the potential harms that can arise. This approach fosters transparency and allows for objective justification of risk acceptability decisions, which is crucial for regulatory compliance and patient safety. An incorrect approach that relies solely on historical data without considering the specific device's context fails to adequately address potential new risks or variations in use. This can lead to regulatory failure by not fulfilling the requirement to identify all foreseeable hazards and hazardous situations. Ethically, it risks patient harm by overlooking risks that might not be present in historical data but are relevant to the current device. Another incorrect approach that uses generic, non-specific probability scales without clear definitions for medical device use is professionally unacceptable. This violates the principle of a well-defined risk management process, making it impossible to consistently and objectively assess risks. It creates an ethical vulnerability by allowing subjective interpretations of probability, potentially leading to a false sense of security or undue caution, both of which can compromise patient safety. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of development over thoroughness in defining severity levels can lead to a risk matrix that is not fit for purpose. This is a regulatory failure as it demonstrates a lack of due diligence in the risk assessment process. Ethically, It is a serious failing, as it can result in the acceptance of risks that are not adequately understood or controlled, directly jeopardizing patient well-being. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the device's intended use, potential misuse, and the target user and patient population. This understanding informs the definition of severity levels, linking them to specific harms. Concurrently, the probability of occurrence should be defined with clear, measurable criteria relevant to the device's life cycle and use environment. The risk matrix should be developed collaboratively, with input from relevant stakeholders, and its definitions and application should be documented meticulously. Regular review and updates to the risk matrix are essential to ensure its continued relevance and effectiveness. Question 14. The review process indicates that the risk management file for a new medical device contains a section detailing the residual risks. However, it lacks a clear explanation of the specific criteria used to determine the acceptability of these residual risks, and the rationale for why each residual risk was deemed acceptable in the context of the device's intended use and foreseeable misuse. Which of the following approaches to documenting the risk evaluation outcomes best aligns with the requirements of ISO 14971? Option A. List all identified residual risks and simply state that they are acceptable based on the collective judgment of the risk management team. Option B. Explicitly state the residual risk, reference the established risk acceptability criteria from the risk management plan, and provide a clear justification for why each residual risk meets these criteria, considering the intended use and foreseeable misuse. Option C. Assign the task of documenting the risk evaluation outcomes to a junior engineer who was not directly involved in the risk assessment process, with instructions to summarize the findings. Option D. Include a summary of the residual risks and a general statement that all risks have been reduced to an acceptable level, as per regulatory guidance. The correct answer is B. Explicitly state the residual risk, reference the established risk acceptability criteria from the risk management plan, and provide a clear justification for why each residual risk meets these criteria, considering the intended use and foreseeable misuse. Explanation. The scenario presents a common implementation challenge in medical device risk management, ensuring that the documentation of risk evaluation outcomes is not merely a perfunctory record, but a meaningful reflection of the decision-making process and its justification. The challenge lies in bridging the gap between the technical assessment of risks and the documented rationale for accepting or mitigating them, particularly when faced with time pressures or differing interpretations of risk acceptability. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the documentation is comprehensive, transparent, and defensible, meeting the requirements of ISO 14971. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core requirement of ISO 14971 for clear and traceable documentation of risk evaluation. It ensures that the rationale behind risk acceptability decisions is explicitly stated, linking the residual risk to the intended use, foreseeable misuse, and the state of the art. This transparency is crucial for regulatory review, post-market surveillance, and future design iterations. It demonstrates a robust risk management process that is not just a checklist but a thoughtful evaluation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on listing residual risks without detailing the justification for their acceptability fails to meet the spirit and letter of ISO 14971. This is a regulatory failure as it omits the critical why behind the decision, making it impossible for reviewers to assess the adequacy of the risk management process. Ethically, it can lead to a false sense of security regarding device safety. Another incorrect approach that relies on vague statements of acceptability without specific reference to the risk acceptability criteria defined earlier in the risk management plan is also a regulatory failure. ISO 14971 mandates that risk acceptability decisions are made against predefined criteria. Without this linkage, the documentation is subjective and lacks objective grounding. This can lead to inconsistent risk acceptance decisions and a lack of accountability. A third incorrect approach that delegates the documentation of risk evaluation outcomes to individuals without direct involvement in the risk assessment process is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. ISO 14971 emphasizes the responsibility of the risk management team. Outsourcing the documentation without proper oversight or understanding of the underlying risk assessments can lead to inaccuracies, omissions, and a disconnect between the actual risk evaluation and its recorded outcome. This undermines the integrity of the entire risk management file. The professional reasoning process for such situations should involve 1. Understanding the explicit requirements of ISO 14971 regarding the documentation of risk evaluation outcomes, particularly clauses related to the risk management report and the documentation of risk acceptability. 2. Ensuring that the documentation clearly articulates the residual risk, the criteria against which it was evaluated, and the justification for its acceptability. 3. Verifying that the individuals responsible for documenting these outcomes have a thorough understanding of the risk assessment and the rationale behind the decisions. 4. Maintaining traceability between the risk assessment activities, the risk acceptability criteria, and the documented outcomes. 5. Recognizing that the documentation serves as evidence of a compliant and effective risk management process. Question 15. The analysis reveals that a medical device has been successfully marketed for 8 years, with no significant reported adverse events. However, recent post-market surveillance data has indicated a slight increase in user-reported minor usability issues, which were not explicitly identified as risks during the initial design and development phase. According to the principles of ISO 14971, what is the most appropriate action regarding the risk management lifecycle? Option A. Initiate a review of the risk management file to assess the impact of the new usability data on identified risks and to consider if new risks have emerged. Option B. Defer any re-evaluation until a significant number of serious adverse events are reported, as minor usability issues do not warrant a full risk management review. Option C. Conclude that the device's long market history and lack of serious adverse events indicate the initial risk assessment remains valid and no further action is required. Option D. Update the usability documentation to reflect the reported issues, but consider the risk management process complete as the device has passed its initial validation. The correct answer is A. Initiate a review of the risk management file to assess the impact of the new usability data on identified risks and to consider if new risks have emerged. Explanation. The analysis reveals a common challenge in medical device risk management, determining the appropriate point to reevaluate risks within the product lifecycle. ISO 14971 mandates a continuous risk management process, not a one-time assessment. The scenario presents a device that has been on the market for several years, implying a need to revisit its risk profile due to potential changes or new information. The professional challenge lies in balancing the cost and effort of reevaluation against the imperative to ensure ongoing patient safety and regulatory compliance. A proactive approach is crucial to identify emerging risks before they lead to adverse events. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns directly with the principles of ISO 14971, specifically the requirement for risk management activities to be performed throughout the entire lifecycle of the medical device. This includes post-production phases. By initiating a review based on the availability of new information, post-market surveillance data, the manufacturer is demonstrating a commitment to continuous improvement and proactive risk mitigation, which is a core ethical and regulatory expectation. This approach ensures that the risk management file remains current and reflects the actual use and performance of the device in the field, thereby safeguarding patients and users. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the initial risk assessment performed at the time of market release fails to acknowledge the dynamic nature of medical devices and their use. This is a significant regulatory failure, as it contravenes the explicit requirements of ISO 14971 for ongoing risk management. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty to ensure patient safety once the device is in widespread use. Another incorrect approach that dismisses the need for re-evaluation due to the device's long history on the market is equally problematic. The passage of time does not inherently reduce risk. In fact, it can increase it through factors like component degradation, changes in user practices, or the emergence of new medical knowledge. This approach demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adapt to evolving circumstances, potentially leading to the use of outdated risk assessments. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of post-market surveillance data. When new information emerges, whether from complaints, adverse event reports, scientific literature, or changes in regulatory expectations, it should trigger a review of the existing risk management file. This review should assess whether the new information impacts the previously identified risks, necessitates the identification of new risks, or requires updates to risk control measures. The decision to reevaluate should be based on the potential impact on device safety and effectiveness, not solely on the age of the device or the perceived burden of the reevaluation process. Question 16. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a medical device manufacturer has received an increasing number of post-market reports detailing unexpected performance degradation in a specific patient population. While the number of reports is still relatively small compared to the total number of devices in use, the reported degradation could potentially lead to a suboptimal therapeutic outcome. The manufacturer's internal analysis suggests that the degradation might be linked to a specific environmental factor not extensively tested during pre-market validation. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the manufacturer? Option A. Initiate a comprehensive investigation into the reported performance degradation, including root cause analysis, assessment of clinical impact, and consultation with clinical experts, while continuing to monitor the situation closely and engaging with regulatory authorities. Option B. Immediately halt all distribution and recall all devices from the market to prevent any further potential risk to patients, pending a full investigation. Option C. Issue a voluntary safety alert to all healthcare providers using the device, advising them to discontinue use until further notice, without conducting a detailed investigation first. Option D. Classify the reports as statistically insignificant given the low incidence rate, and continue with routine post-market surveillance without further immediate action. The correct answer is A. Initiate a comprehensive investigation into the reported performance degradation, including root cause analysis, assessment of clinical impact, and consultation with clinical experts, while continuing to monitor the situation closely and engaging with regulatory authorities. Explanation. This scenario presents a common ethical dilemma in post-market surveillance where a manufacturer receives conflicting signals from real-world data. Challenge lies in balancing the immediate need to protect patient safety with the potential for overreaction based on incomplete or potentially misleading information, while adhering to regulatory obligations. The manufacturer must critically evaluate the significance of the reported events in the context of the device's intended use, known failure modes, and the overall benefit-risk profile. The correct approach involves a systematic and evidence-based investigation. This includes thoroughly analyzing the reported adverse events, determining causality, assessing the frequency and severity, and comparing this data to pre-market expectations and established benchmarks. It requires engaging with clinical experts and regulatory bodies to ensure a comprehensive understanding and appropriate response. This aligns with the principles of ISO 14971, which mandates continuous risk management throughout the device lifecycle, including the post-market phase. The ethical imperative is to act responsibly to safeguard public health, which necessitates a data-driven, rather than purely reactive decision. An incorrect approach would be to immediately halt distribution or issue a recall based solely on a few anecdotal reports without proper investigation. This could lead to unnecessary disruption of patient care, significant financial and reputational damage to the company, and potentially erode trust in the regulatory process. Ethically, it represents a failure to exercise due diligence and a potential overreach of authority without sufficient evidence. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the reports as statistically insignificant without a rigorous analysis of their potential clinical impact or underlying causes. This could lead to a failure to identify a genuine safety issue, thereby violating the manufacturer's duty to protect patients and potentially leading to serious harm. This demonstrates a disregard for the post-market surveillance obligations and a failure to uphold the principle of do no harm. Professionals should approach such situations by first establishing a clear process for receiving, triaging, and investigating post-market data. This process should involve cross-functional teams e.g., quality, regulatory, clinical, R&D, and a defined escalation pathway. When faced with concerning data, the decision-making process should prioritize patient safety, followed by a thorough risk assessment that considers the quality and reliability of the data, the potential severity of harm, and the likelihood of occurrence. This assessment should inform the decision on the appropriate risk mitigation actions, which could range from further data collection and analysis to product modification, labeling changes, or, in severe cases, withdrawal from the market. Transparency with regulatory authorities and clear communication with healthcare professionals and patients are also critical components of responsible risk management. Question 17. Quality control measures reveal that while a manufacturer has a documented risk management plan for a new medical device, the Associated Risk Management File, RMF, lacks detailed records of the risk analysis performed for specific software components and the rationale for the acceptability of residual risks identified during the design phase. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory requirements for documentation under ISO 14971? Option A. The existence of a detailed risk management plan is sufficient evidence of compliance, as it outlines the intended risk management process. Option B. Risk management documentation can be finalized after the device has been released to the market, provided that any identified post-market risks are addressed. Option C. The RMF must contain comprehensive records demonstrating the execution of all risk management activities, including detailed risk analyses, risk evaluations, and the justification for residual risk acceptability throughout the device lifecycle. Option D. The final risk assessment report, summarizing the overall residual risk, is the primary document required, with supporting details being optional for initial regulatory submissions. The correct answer is C. The RMF must contain comprehensive records demonstrating the execution of all risk management activities, including detailed risk analyses, risk evaluations, and the justification for residual risk acceptability throughout the device lifecycle. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, ensuring that the documentation supporting the risk management process is not only present, but also meets the specific, stringent requirements of ISO 14971 and relevant regulatory frameworks. The challenge lies in the detail and traceability required, which often goes beyond simply having records. It demands that these records accurately reflect the risk management activities undertaken throughout the device lifecycle and are readily accessible for review and audit. The correct approach emphasizes the comprehensive and integrated nature of risk management documentation, as mandated by ISO 14971. Best professional practice dictates that the Risk Management File, RMF, should be a living document, containing all records necessary to demonstrate that the manufacturer has complied with the standards requirements. This includes evidence of risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk control, and the overall residual risk acceptability. The RMF serves as the primary evidence for regulatory bodies and internal quality systems that the device has been developed and maintained with an adequate level of safety. Adherence to this approach ensures traceability, verifiability, and compliance, which are fundamental to patient safety and regulatory approval. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the existence of a risk management plan, without ensuring its execution and the documentation of subsequent activities, is a significant regulatory failure. The plan is a prerequisite, but it is the implementation and the resulting records that demonstrate compliance. Similarly, an approach that prioritizes the final risk assessment report over the detailed evidence of the risk analysis and control measures is deficient. The final report is a summary. The underlying data and decisions are crucial for understanding the basis of the risk acceptability. Furthermore, an approach that treats risk management documentation as a static, post-development artifact, rather than an ongoing process throughout the device lifecycle, fails to meet the dynamic requirements of ISO 14971. This leads to a lack of evidence for post-market surveillance and design changes, which are critical for maintaining device safety over time. Professionals should approach this by first understanding that ISO 14971 requires a systematic and documented process. The decision-making process should involve verifying that the RMF contains evidence of each required activity, that these records are complete, accurate, and traceable, and that they reflect the current state of the device and its associated risks. This involves cross-referencing the risk management plan with the actual activities performed and the records generated, ensuring that the entire lifecycle of the device is covered. Question 18. During the evaluation of post-market surveillance data for a Class Roman II implantable device, a manufacturer observes a slight but consistent increase over 6 months in reports of localized inflammation at the implant site, with no single report indicating a severe outcome. However, the total number of these reports, while individually minor, has now reached a statistically significant level compared to historical data. What is the most appropriate next step in the risk management process according to ISO 14971? Option A. Initiate a detailed investigation into the root cause of the localized inflammation reports, including a review of manufacturing records, material specifications, and sterilization processes for affected lots, while simultaneously assessing the overall risk profile of the device based on this trend. Option B. Classify these reports as minor, acceptable variations in patient response and continue routine post-market surveillance without further specific investigation into this trend. Option C. Immediately issue a field safety corrective action notice to all healthcare providers, recommending temporary cessation of the device's use until the cause of the inflammation can be definitively identified. Option D. Focus solely on the severity of individual reported events, concluding that since no severe outcomes have been reported, no further action beyond standard monitoring is warranted. The correct answer is A. Initiate a detailed investigation into the root cause of the localized inflammation reports, including a review of manufacturing records, material specifications, and sterilization processes for affected lots, while simultaneously assessing the overall risk profile of the device based on this trend. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common post-market surveillance challenge where a trend of minor, seemingly unrelated adverse events emerges. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between random occurrences and a potential systemic issue that could pose a risk to patient safety. A failure to adequately investigate could lead to a serious hazard going undetected, while an overreaction to noise could lead to unnecessary resource expenditure and potentially disrupt the availability of a beneficial medical device. The professional challenge is to apply a systematic, data-driven approach to risk assessment in the face of uncertainty. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic review of all reported adverse events, looking for patterns, commonalities, and statistical significance. This aligns with the principles of ISO 14971, which mandates post-market surveillance to ensure that risks remain acceptable throughout the device's lifecycle. Specifically, it requires the manufacturer to collect and review information from the use of medical devices, including adverse events, and to take appropriate action if the risk management is no longer adequate. This approach prioritizes patient safety by proactively identifying and mitigating potential risks based on real-world data, fulfilling the ethical and regulatory obligation to monitor device performance and safety after it has been placed on the market. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the reports as isolated incidents without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge the potential for a cumulative risk or a common underlying cause, directly contravening the proactive risk management principles of ISO 14971. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty to patient safety. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately initiate a full-scale recall based on the initial trend without a thorough root cause analysis. This demonstrates a lack of analytical rigor and could lead to unnecessary disruption and cost, potentially impacting patient access to a device that may still be safe and effective for the majority of users. It also fails to follow a structured risk assessment process. A third incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the frequency of individual event types without considering their severity or potential contributing factors. ISO 14971 requires consideration of both the probability and severity of harm. Ignoring severity or other contributing factors leads to an incomplete risk assessment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured, data-driven approach. This involves 1. Establishing clear criteria for identifying trends and potential signals. 2. Systematically collecting and analyzing all relevant post-market data. 3. Performing a risk assessment on identified trends, considering probability, severity, and controllability. 4. Implementing appropriate risk control measures based on the assessment, which may range from enhanced monitoring to corrective actions. 5. Documenting all steps and decisions thoroughly. This process ensures that decisions are evidence-based, proportionate, and compliant with regulatory requirements. Question 19. The monitoring system demonstrates a tendency for intermittent data transmission failures. During risk analysis, the team identifies several potential failure modes for this intermittent transmission. Which of the following approaches to analyzing the risk associated with these failures best aligns with the principles of ISO 14971 for medical devices? Option A. Dismiss potential failure modes if they are perceived to be rare, assuming that the overall system reliability is high enough to mitigate any significant risk. Option B. Evaluate the severity of potential patient harm resulting from the data transmission failure and the probability of that harm occurring, considering the context of the device's intended use. Option C. Focus primarily on the frequency with which the data transmission failures occur, as this directly indicates the likelihood of a problem. Option D. Rely on the subjective experience of the clinical users to gauge the impact of the data transmission failures on patient care. The correct answer is B. Evaluate the severity of potential patient harm resulting from the data transmission failure and the probability of that harm occurring, considering the context of the device's intended use. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management: the identification and analysis of risks associated with a complex system where multiple components interact. The monitoring system, by its nature, collects and processes data, which introduces potential failure modes that could impact patient safety. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that the risk analysis is comprehensive, accurate, and aligned with the principles of ISO 14971, specifically focusing on the risk analysis phase. This requires a deep understanding of potential failure mechanisms, their causes, and their effects on the intended use and foreseeable misuse of the device. It also demands careful consideration of the severity of potential harm and the likelihood of its occurrence, without resorting to simplistic or incomplete assessments. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it systematically addresses the identified failure modes by evaluating their potential impact on patient safety. This aligns directly with the core tenets of ISO 14971, which mandates a thorough risk analysis to understand the nature and magnitude of risks. By considering the severity of harm and the probability of occurrence for each failure mode, the manufacturer can then proceed to risk evaluation and control, ensuring that residual risks are acceptable. This structured, evidence-based approach is ethically sound as it prioritizes patient well-being and regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the frequency of the failure mode, without considering the severity of the potential harm, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. ISO 14971 requires both probability and severity to be assessed to determine the level of risk. Ignoring severity can lead to underestimation of critical risks, potentially exposing patients to unacceptable harm. Another incorrect approach that dismisses potential failure modes due to their perceived low probability, without a robust justification based on data or expert opinion, is also a regulatory failure. ISO 14971 emphasizes that even low-probability events can lead to severe harm, and their risks must be adequately analyzed. Furthermore, an approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or subjective judgment rather than systematic analysis and objective data is ethically problematic, as it deviates from the rigorous, documented process required for medical device risk management. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the device's intended use and foreseeable misuse. This understanding should guide the identification of hazards and hazardous situations. For each identified hazard, a systematic analysis of potential failure modes, their causes, and their effects must be conducted. This analysis should be supported by objective data, expert opinion, and relevant standards. The severity of potential harm and the probability of occurrence must then be estimated using defined criteria. This information forms the basis for risk evaluation, where the acceptability of the risk is determined. If a risk is deemed unacceptable, appropriate risk control measures must be implemented and verified. The entire process must be documented thoroughly to demonstrate compliance with ISO 14971. Question 20. The monitoring system demonstrates a potential for user error leading to incorrect readings, which could result in delayed or inappropriate treatment. The engineering team has proposed a software update that would introduce additional validation steps before data is displayed, and a separate proposal suggests enhancing user training protocols to emphasize correct data entry procedures. A third option involves a hardware modification to physically prevent certain incorrect inputs. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the risk control measures hierarchy as defined in ISO 14971 for addressing this hazard? Option A. Prioritizing the hardware modification, followed by the software update, and then enhanced user training as supplementary measures. Option B. Enhancing user training protocols to emphasize correct data entry procedures. Option C. Introducing additional validation steps through a software update. Option D. Implementing the hardware modification to physically prevent incorrect inputs. The correct answer is D. Implementing the hardware modification to physically prevent incorrect inputs. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for a functional risk control measure with the long-term imperative of adhering to the established hierarchy of controls as mandated by ISO 14971. The pressure to deploy a solution quickly, especially if it addresses a critical safety concern, can lead to overlooking more robust, albeit potentially slower to implement, control measures. The ethical dilemma lies in deciding whether a less ideal but immediately available control is acceptable in the short term, or if the organization must strictly adhere to the hierarchy even if it delays deployment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, prioritizing elimination or substitution, represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the root cause of the hazard. ISO 14971 emphasizes that the most effective risk control measures are those that eliminate the hazard or reduce the risk by modifying the design or materials. Elimination removes the hazard entirely, while substitution replaces a hazardous element with a less hazardous one. These methods are inherently more reliable and less prone to human error or failure compared to administrative controls or PPE. Ethically, this approach demonstrates a commitment to patient safety by proactively seeking the most effective and sustainable risk reduction strategies, aligning with the fundamental principles of medical device risk management. Incorrect approaches analysis. Prioritizing administrative controls over engineering controls or substitution represents a regulatory failure because it deviates from the established hierarchy. Administrative controls, such as training or work procedures, are less effective as they rely on human compliance and can be prone to error. Ethically, this approach places a greater burden on the user and potentially compromises safety by not seeking a more inherent solution. Implementing only PPE as the primary risk control measure is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. PPE is considered the least effective control measure as it relies on the user to correctly don, maintain, and utilize it, and it does not eliminate the hazard itself. ISO 14971 clearly places PPE at the bottom of the hierarchy, to be used only when other measures are not feasible or as a supplementary control. Relying solely on PPE can lead to a false sense of security and increased risk if the PPE fails or is misused. Implementing engineering controls without first considering elimination or substitution is a partial regulatory failure. While engineering controls are highly effective, the hierarchy dictates that elimination and substitution should be explored first as they offer a more fundamental and often more robust risk reduction. Ethically, this approach is better than administrative controls or PPE alone, but it misses the opportunity for a potentially more complete risk mitigation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making process guided by ISO 14971. This involves thoroughly identifying hazards, assessing risks, and then systematically evaluating potential risk control measures according to the hierarchy. The process should involve a multidisciplinary team to ensure all perspectives are considered. When faced with a situation where immediate deployment is desired, professionals must document the rationale for any deviation from the hierarchy, including a plan for migrating to higher-level controls as soon as feasible. The primary consideration must always be the safety of the patient and the effectiveness of the risk control.